this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
What's up, fam? It's sports journalist Ari Chambers.
Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your girl, Sam J.
And we're the hosts of Everyone Watches Women's Sports, a new podcast from Together.
We're breaking down the biggest headlines, the viral moments, and the stories everyone's talking about across women's sports.
From game-changing performances to culture-shifting conversations, we'll give you our takes, our debates, and a few laughs along the way.
Because everyone watches women's sports. Listen to Everyone Watches Women's Sports
on the iHeartRadio app,
Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Joy is essential, and it's also elusive. But now, there's a new and exciting way to start your journey toward a more joyful existence. Joy 101. It's a new podcast hosted by me, Hoda Kotb. If you're craving inspiration to maximize your joy, tune into these candid, uplifting, and moving on-air chats. Open your free iHeartRadio app, search Joy 101, and listen now. Joy 101 with Hoda Kotb is presented by CVS.
Hey everyone, it's the Jonas Brothers. This week on the podcast, Hey Jonas, we're hanging out with Michael Bublé. After Kevin's recent interesting confession about Michael, we figured there's only one thing to do. We must invite Michael Bublé on the podcast, and we want to know what's on his Sexy Time playlist.
You know, I did an interview, and they're like, have you heard about this Jonas Brothers thing? And they were like, what did you think of it? And I was like, well, I mean, it's reciprocal.
We talk about Kevin's confession, Michael's reaction, and a whole lot more. Our conversation with Michael Bublé is out now. Listen to Hey Jonas on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
30 years ago, an island off Manhattan almost brought down New York City.
Who will you trust? Your friends and neighbors? Or will you trust the people 5 miles overseas?
This is a story about neighbors turning on each other and what happens when a forgotten place decides it's had enough.
But we're not stopping, are we?
Listen to Revisionist History, The Staten Island Problem on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
You've reached American History Hotline. You ask the questions, we get the answers. Leave a message.
Hey there, American History Hotliners. Your host, Bob Crawford here. Happy to be joining you again for another American History Hotline. You're the ones with the questions. I'm the guy trying to get some answers. And keep those questions coming. The best way to get us a question is to record a video or a voice memo on your phone and email it to AmericanHistoryHotline@gmail.com. That's American History Hotline, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, we are American History Hotline. I love ancient Egypt as much as the next guy, but there's plenty to talk about on this continent. Okay, today's question is about the Civil War. Here to help me answer the question is Catherine Oliverius. She's an associate professor of history at Stanford University, specializing in 19th century U.S. history. Catherine, thanks for being on the show.
I am delighted to be here, and I love talking about the Civil War.
It is so much fun, isn't it?
Yeah, for us, a few years later, decades after the fact, it's certainly fun.
Yes, a century and a half after the fact.
Yeah,
not too soon.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to be at Gettysburg myself. So yeah.
No, or Andersonville.
Yes, big
right.
No.
Right. So our question today comes from Cheryl from Santa Fe, New Mexico. She says, I heard that more soldiers died from disease during the Civil War than they did in battle. Is that true?
Yes. Yes, actually, in the Civil War, approximately 2/3 of all the Civil War dead died from disease, not from bullets, not from battlefield injuries. So that's about 2/3 of approximately 750,000 people who died during the war. And that number itself, that 750,000 number, is up for debate. We actually don't have the best records, but if you were a soldier on either side of the war, whether you were with the Union Army, the Federal Army, or the Confederate States of America, you had a very high chance of dying from disease, especially diseases like dysentery, crowd diseases, diseases of malnutrition, things like this, far away from any kind of battlefield.
And like you said, it didn't matter which army you were with, but was one army better equipped to prevent disease than another?
Yes, certainly. So by far, so the Union Army, this is the Northern Army, the United States Army, it had a high death rate, but it was you would have a much better chance, sort of proportionally, of surviving this war if you were in the North. The Southern Army, the Confederate States of America, they never had the kind of medical service or ambulance corps that was required to lodge this total modern war, filled with mini balls and shrapnel and things like this. And so if you were in the South, you had a much higher chance of dying from disease. One little twist to this, of course, is that if you were in the Union Army, black soldiers in the Union Army had a much higher chance of dying from disease than did white soldiers, generally because they received worse medical care and because they were often given much deadlier assignments and sort of dirtier assignments too. So you were more in contact with pathogens and also more in the line of fire if you were a black soldier.
Can you paint a picture for us of the conditions soldiers were living in during the war and how that contributed to the spread of disease?
Yeah. So, I mean, think about it. So we have this, Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 troops in 1861 from volunteers from across the North. And he gets those volunteers and many, many more. And suddenly you have this sort of massive churn of people. So a lot of historians actually talk about the Civil War as a kind of biotic soup, and that you're just like stirring this pot constantly with people moving around the country, bringing with them diseases, immunities, things like this, pathogens with them to the front. So if you're a soldier, suddenly you are arriving in a camp. This is a very crowded place. You are often responsible for cooking your own food and procuring it, or you might be given some rations or some kinds of meat or corn or something like this, but you are generally in charge of cooking it yourself. And these are, for the most part, pretty young boys who have very little experience with food preparation. They're not so good at keeping things clean. This is around the time that germ theory is happening, so that people are understanding that, that germs can cause diseases. But most common soldiers would have had no idea. This is very much in the sort of early stage of development at this point. So they would have had very little idea about that. And if you were in a camp, it rains, it's muddy. Generally speaking, people would, if there was a water source close by, like a stream, you would wash in it, you would drink from it, you would probably defecate into it too. So we're talking about this is like a germ bonanza suddenly. And we're talking again also about people from all across the country, people who've maybe never been exposed to diseases like whooping cough or diseases like measles before, suddenly are being put into very close contact with people who are maybe bringing these pathogens in. And of course, remember too that every single soldier was screened before coming into the army. So, this means that if you're obviously, infectious with something, you would be denied entry into the army. If you were, blind, or if you were impaired in some capacity too. But as the war is dragging on, as the draft is being instituted too, medical examiners are being sort of leaned on to kind of look the other way about this, about pretty obvious diseases, because they just need bodies, they need soldiers. And so they're adopting a laxer and laxer attitude towards infectious disease. So therefore, more and more people are entering this army, bringing these kinds of infectious ailments. Again, smallpox, measles, things like this. But then also they're arriving in these camps. And when when you're on the front, you are just inundated by these crowd diseases, these diseases of malnutrition, and these bacteria that can cause really serious gastro, ailments that will eventually kill you. I think that Walt Whitman said something like, 99.99% of war is diarrhea and 1% is glory or something. And I think that that's true of all wars in the, before the modern era. But it's certainly true of the Civil War, which is just, again, this biotic soup is being churned.
So you talk about the untenable conditions that these guys were in. What were the main diseases that were killing people at this time?
So typhus, this is the big one of soldiers. This basically means that you are ingesting this bacterium and you are essentially becoming dehydrated over time because you develop diarrhea. This is a huge, huge ailment during the war. As is malaria. If you were posted in the South, and if you were a boy from sort of, let's say, Boston or from Connecticut, you probably had not been exposed to malaria at any point in your life before this. If you were on a Southern campaign, and most of this war, of course, was fought in the South, you are suddenly faced with this, mosquito-borne ailment, which may not kill you, but it could, massively reduce your health, your fighting capacity. And of course, all of these diseases, we're used to talking about this now with COVID, but we're talking about many, many comorbidities, people who have a very high viral or bacterial load who are vulnerable to other kinds of opportunistic infections. And so by far the sort of the biggest, most, the sort of prototypical disease of wars, of course, typhus, typhoid, diphtheria, these kinds of very contagious diseases that can kill you very quickly. And that's far and away the sort of the most common kinds of ailments that you would get away from the front. But also too, if you were a soldier in this war and you were shot by a mini ball, or you were, got a piece of shrapnel in your arm, you were also in big trouble. You could potentially die quite quickly of sepsis, often after being, having a limb amputated, things like this. Gangrene could set in with frightening rapidity in one of these very, very honestly disgusting field hospitals that were a sort of mainstay of medical care in this war.
This is American History Hotline. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. Today, my guest is Catherine Oliverius. She's an associate professor of history at Stanford University. We're talking about diseases in the Civil War. Let's talk about sexually transmitted diseases. I read that syphilis and gonorrhea weren't really killing a lot of soldiers, but they were spreading like crazy during the war. Is this why we think it would be?
So yes, this is potentially the subject of my next book, or at least a chapter of my next book, about the rapid rise of syphilis during and after the Civil War. So when I was researching my last book, there were sort of two data points that came to mind very quickly, or that really stood out to me. One is that physicians in and around New York, they estimated that before the war, so 1860, that approximately 10% of adult American men at one point would have had gonorrhea or syphilis. This is data that's very shaky for a lot of different reasons, and it's certainly has a New York City urban bias, which would inflate those numbers. But that's still that's a sizable percent. But fast forward 2 generations to 1900, the American Public Health Association, they're sounding the alarm bells because they're saying now that between 18 and 20% of adult American men over the age of 12 had active syphilis. That this is a serious sexually transmitted infection, probably the most terrifying disease before antibiotics. And so during this war, well, basically, you can sort of think about this war as a kind of, again, this biotic soup is being stirred here, but you can think about this as a kind of super spreader event for syphilis, where you have a lot of young boys who are, between sort of late teens, early 20s. They come into this war. They are reckless for the future, as many, many boys, of course, are today, as, even still. And I've seen this in many, many letters where, you have soldiers who say, basically, I want to have sex for the first time or maybe for the last time. And so they sleep with prostitutes. And this becomes, again, this kind of just recurring and snowballing problem where increasingly officers are sounding the alarms about this, where they're saying, these boys are coming in, they maybe have syphilis. They don't necessarily have symptoms, or maybe they do have symptoms, but they've made it past the medical examination. And suddenly, they're worried that basically this is actually hurting their ability to wage and fight war because so many young boys were in the hospital ward, in the BD hospital wards in Tennessee or in Washington, D.C. And then there's this recurring problem. And then sort of secondary to this, which is the kind of real, I think, tragedy. So syphilis is, for many people will not really ever develop major symptoms. For some people, they'll be okay. But for many people, as you develop into the secondary, so you go from sort of the primary to the secondary to the tertiary stage. And the tertiary stage is probably what most people are sort of familiar with. This is where you might lose your nose. You might wear sunglasses. Due to
Wait a minute. Wait. You might lose your nose?
Yeah. So this can happen also decades after the primary infection. But, the most famous and horrifying symptoms of syphilis is that you develop these kind of gummas, these kind of like indentations in your head. A lot of people will lose their nose tissue and tissue on their face in general. A lot of people become paralyzed, permanently paralyzed, or they go blind, they go deaf. It's this, and it's, and up through the secondary stage. This is the tertiary stage we're talking about now, when you can lose your mind and you descend into death in this really horrible manner. You can spread this very easily, not just to the people that you sleep with, but also to your children. And to your children, this is one of the sort of saddest parts about this. That's so-called, at the time it was called the infection of innocence. These are unsuspecting wives and children. And if you had a child who survived to be born, very often they would be, if they were syphilitic, they would be born blind or otherwise deformed. And many, many would be stillborn and wouldn't live very long after being born. So it's a really horrible illness. And it's the sort of biggest tragedy of this, of course, is that it's now extremely curable by penicillin. In fact, penicillin is so effective in treating syphilis that even if you are allergic to penicillin, doctors will still recommend that you take penicillin. And so this is, yeah.
Yeah. So what were the treatments back then? Were there any treatments back then?
So doctors recommended a bunch of stuff, none of which we know this today that they were not. These were not cures for syphilis actually, but these were what doctors prescribed essentially to do something. So the major cure would have been mercury or calomel. And so if you were, let's say, a 25-year-old lawyer who goes to your doctor, he would say to you, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're, first of all, even if your wife comes in with this disease, I won't tell her, first of all, that she has syphilis, because that would be betraying your confidence. But you have to do a few things. You shouldn't sleep with anybody for 4 to 6 years. You should ingest mercury on a daily basis sometimes, or bathe in it, depending if you had a rash. Bathe in it, put it all over your body, vapor bath in it sometimes. They would, ask you to do this, and basically to kind of kill things within your body. The idea was it's in a similar way that sort of chemotherapy work today, that you're I think their idea was that you sort of, if you kill off enough healthy tissue, you also, or, to kill off the syphilis bacterium, you would also have to kill off, plenty of healthy tissue too. And that was sort of the therapeutic idea behind it. But of course, mercury, this is really toxic stuff. It can easily kill you if you take too much of it. So, and you have many, many cases of this. So before killing you, you will also probably lose your teeth, you will lose your hair. Many people talk about being sort of salivated constantly. You produce tons of saliva. It's a really, and you feel horrible. Because again, it's toxic, it's a poison. So this, many people, in fact, thought that they would rather take their chances with the disease rather than the alleged cure. That was how horrible it was.
We mentioned your book a little bit earlier. I just want to let our listeners know that your book was Necropolis, Disease, Power, and Capitalism in the Cotton Kingdom. That came out in 2022. And we look forward to your next book.
Me too.
So were there any preventative measures for syphilis other than don't have sex?
So actually, condoms did exist. Vulcanized rubber had been around, but generally speaking, though they were not used, and often they would be used and reused. So they kind of get rid of their efficacy, of course. But really, the cure for syphilis is abstinence. And back in those days, at least, which is that at least when you're when the person's infectious, which varies widely. But generally you're infectious during the primary and secondary stages. And that can be anywhere from a few weeks to a few years. And it's really hard to know, of course. So that is the only cure at the time. And some people, again, they never developed serious symptoms. They were, okay. They were largely asymptomatic. So, it could kind of, but again, asymptomatic while still being contagious. That's sort of the dangerous part here too. So you're spreading this unknowingly, or knowingly sometimes too, but quite unknowingly. And this is the thing where you have all these boys who, when they muster out in 1865 after Appomattox, they go home and they're at this age where they're going to get married. There's also a marriage boom after this war where suddenly everyone seems to be wanting to get married real fast to have kids. And so you see this transmission of diseases, of syphilis in particular, from the battlefront to the home front. And this is a really, like, you can see this, basically this sort of connection between war and home in a really serious and really devastating way with syphilis.
What's up, fam? I'm sports journalist Ari Chambers.
Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your girl, Sam J.
And we're the hosts of Everyone Watches Women's Sports, a new podcast from Together and iHeart Women's Sports.
Because let's be real, women's sports is giving us way too much to talk about these days.
The highlights, the rivalries, the breakout stars, the moments that take over your entire timeline.
And the conversations that start during the game and somehow keep going all week.
Every week, we're breaking down the biggest stories across women's sports.
We'll give you our takes, our debates, and probably a few disagreements.
We'll talk to athletes, celebrate big moments, and get into what's happening on and off the field, court, track, and beyond.
Because we're not just interested in what happened, we're interested in why everyone's talking about it. Because everyone watches women's sports. So if you're already a fan,
or you're just getting into the game, there's a seat for you right here.
Listen to Everyone Watches Women's Sports
on the iHeartRadio app,
Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, I'm Hoda Kotb, host of the podcast Joy 101 with Hoda Kotb. Okay, if you know me, you know this. I'm always searching for inspiration, for support, and useful tools to help maximize joy. So this podcast lets us uncover all of that together. We're going to have these meaningful conversations with the world's most fascinating people, like when actress Olivia Munn shared how she overcame fierce health challenges that she never saw coming.
I've gone through breast cancer and then helped my mother through breast cancer, and that was more difficult. There's a lot of people who understand postpartum depression. I was not prepared for postpartum anxiety.
Olympic champ Shawn Johnson revealed why she had no choice but to be a gymnast.
There was something about gymnastics that was intoxicating to me. It's given me a belief that we all have one of those treasures inside of us. We just have to find it.
Listen to Joy 101 with Hoda Kotb on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
My first guest is Paris Hilton, Shakira, Luke and Yerin, Samira y Gracie. I'm so excited.
On the bouncy bed.
You have surprises?
Many surprises.
Welcome to Suite 305, where the group chat comes to life. What up? Es como que una forma de decir como, hola amiga, hola mejor amiga, hola hermana, what up?
Mira, nunca lo había hablado con nadie. Excepto con mis hijos. Mis hijos sí saben.
Yes. Sé mi amante.
Uf. Punch. Qué increíble. Ya la telenovela.
You're the only person I know that loves a yellow starburst.
It's lemonade. No hay alguien que te falta, como que tú dices, me gustaría colaborar con esta persona. This is Suite 305. Listen to Suite 305 with Lele Pons as part of My Cultura podcast network on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Jake Brennan, and on the Disgraceland podcast, I explore the wild lives of rock stars and unbelievable true crime stories from music history. These are the stories you haven't heard, the kind you'll end up telling someone else. Like the time Paul McCartney spent in one of the world's most notorious prisons. Imagine that. You're Paul McCartney. It's 1980. You're an ex-Beatle, and you're doing time in one of Japan's worst prisons, right there alongside Yakuza gangsters, and for a ridiculous charge. Or the bizarre crime Lady Gaga is accused of. Who is the artist Lady Gaga is being accused of doing the unthinkable to, after allegedly stealing her music and style to become famous? And what about that time Blondie's Debbie Harry escaped a serial killer? The man who had given her that ride she barely escaped from was Ted Bundy. Listen to Disgraceland on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is American History Hotline. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. Today, my guest is Catherine Oliverius. She's an associate professor of history at Stanford University. We're talking about how rough it was to be a soldier during the Civil War because of disease. Remember to send us your burning questions about American history. Record yourself using the voice memo app on your phone and email it to americanhistoryhotline@gmail.com. Now back to our show. We've been talking about diseases during the Civil War. Let's talk about medical treatment. It's the early 1860s. What's the state of medicine at this time? Was there antibiotics? What about sterilization techniques?
So the sort of simple answer to this is no and no. No antibiotics and no real concept of sterilization techniques. However, actually, the Crimean War had happened in the 1850s, and this is the war that made Florence Nightingale famous and kind of gave birth to modern nursing and this idea of keeping hospital wards in that basically in controlling disease, you could actually really you could obviously lessen the death rate of any disease, and you could do that by keeping hospitals and medical facilities sanitary. So these ideas were out there, they were percolating around, but again, most people would have had very little concept of germs, certainly no concept of viruses being different from bacteria, none of these things. They would have had various ideas about what kinds of diseases sort of geographically or climatically fit within the United States, most certainly. So a lot of Northern boys were very nervous about being posted not just to the South, but to the Deep South. This is because of yellow fever and because of malaria. These are boys with very little exposure to tropical diseases, previous exposure. So they're nervous about this. And sort of what would happen if you became sick is that, during your, morning roll call, you would, if you were really, really sick, you would announce to your commanding officer that you needed to go to the hospital, you needed to see a doctor. And then you would, if they thought that was appropriate, then you would go to a hospital where you might be for a long time. But actually, fundamentally, soldiers wanted to avoid hospitals as much as possible because these were places that were considered to be disease factories.
Right.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, were there things that doctors were doing that were contributing to soldiers' deaths?
Yes. And, this is sort of one of the, I would say maybe the grossest elements of this war in many ways. So every single field hospital had what was called a pile outside of the back door. Basically, this is a pile of limbs that have been amputated by the surgeons, by doctors. And remember, there were never enough doctors or surgeons in this war, especially in the South. We're talking like one surgeon for every, I think, 1,000 soldiers by the end of the war. And that's not good at all. Your chances of recovering if you're sick. So what would happen? So if, let's say you're at a big battle like Gettysburg. So a part of the infrastructure of war, of course, is that, you have the sort of the front lines who are fighting, but you also have the kind of back matter. You have people who are establishing field hospitals. You have people, you have ambulance drivers who are going onto the battlefield seeking to get people off as quickly as possible. And their job was incredibly important because your chances for survival, if you were taken off of the battlefield, if you were seen by a surgeon and you had an amputation, for example, your chances for survival went way up if that happened within 24 hours. If you start taking past that 24 hours, chances that you're going to develop gangrene, sepsis, and then die, often after being sort of hacked apart by a surgeon, are pretty high. So these surgeons also, too, remember, this is not really their fault because they don't understand how diseases works. And, they did not understand how bacteria worked. But, you have a surgeon who's going down the line after a very chaotic battle like Gettysburg, for example, or Cold Harbor. And they're using the same exact saw on every single person. They're not using gloves. And they're just literally, they're going down the line. This is, cutting off hands, cutting off limbs and things like this. So, and then, those legs or, those amputated body parts are then being put into the pile outside. And so you have not just doctors, but also, you have nurses who are going down between the lines of each person too. So they're basically kind of acting as vectors between each person, unknowingly, of course, but still you have this is why we see this, very rapid spread of infection very often after many battles.
How do deaths from disease during the Civil War stack up against other U.S. wars?
Well, the Civil War is the deadliest war in American history. This is 750,000 people died during this war. This is per capita. And, your chances, again, if you were in the South, the sort of proportionate death rate was much, much, much higher. I think it's something like 1 in 4 Confederate men who enlisted died during the war, and many more were made casualties. It's a large number, maybe 1 in 3. So, this is an extremely deadly event. And you see also, of course, as we move into the 20th century, you see diseases, that are, like World War I, for example. And I grew up in the UK, and World War I was kind of the sort of paradigmatic disease that I was taught about that sort of exists in the kind of culture and the way that the Civil War perhaps does here. But in every town you have in England, you have a little sort of obelisk, a little memorial to the war dead. And many, many, many of those soldiers died from diseases. Syphilis, too, in fact. But, it's not, war is not as before, the modern era, many, many, many people would have died from what we would consider today to be quite curable diseases. And so armies, the sort of brass of every army, was really dedicated, of course, towards, increasingly dedicated towards making sure that conditions were sanitary, that hospitals were established and well-staffed. This became a sort of imperative of waging a modern war. And so we see, deaths from disease decrease as time goes on. Today it's much lower than it was during the Civil War. But really before the 20th century, this is a kind of fact of life in war, which is that disease is going to really be what gets you for the most part. And disease also, or especially in this Civil War too, where we have mini balls, which are designed, this is the bullet that was sort of used. These are designed they're designed to sort of basically splinter your bones and fragment in your body. So they kind of spread out and therefore can cause within your body. And that's why infections became so serious. So we have, this is just, again, biotic soup. And this is the sort of the most condensed, most concentrated version of that biotic soup happening during the Civil War.
Catherine, thank you so much for answering our question today. Catherine Oliverius, she's an associate professor of history at Stanford University. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to American History Hotline, a production of iHeart Podcasts and Scratch Track Productions. The show's executive producer is James Morrison. Our executive producers from iHeart are Jordan Runtall and Jason English. Original music composed by me, Bob Crawford. Please keep in touch. Our email is americanhistoryhotline@gmail.com. If you like the show, please tell your friends and leave us a review in Apple Podcasts. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. Feel free to hit me up on social media to ask a history question or to let me know what you think of the show. You can find me at Bob Crawford Base. Thanks so much for listening. See you next week.
What's up, fam? It's sports journalist Ari Chambers.
Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your girl, Sam J.
And we're the hosts of Everyone Watches Women's Sports, a new podcast from Together.
We're breaking down the biggest headlines, the viral moments, and the stories everyone's talking about across women's sports.
From game-changing performances to culture-shifting conversations, we'll give you our takes, our debates, and a few laughs along the way.
Because everyone watches women's sports. Listen to Everyone Watches Women's Sports
on the iHeartRadio app,
Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Joy is essential, and it's also elusive. But now, there's a new and exciting way to start your journey toward a more joyful existence. Joy 101. It's a new podcast hosted by me, Hoda Kotb. If you're craving inspiration to maximize your joy, tune into these candid, uplifting, and moving on-air chats. Open your free iHeartRadio app, search Joy 101, and listen now. Joy 101 with Hoda Kotb is presented by CVS.
Hey everyone, it's the Jonas Brothers. This week on the podcast, Hey Jonas, we're hanging out with Michael Bublé. After Kevin's recent interesting confession about Michael, we figured there's only one thing to do. We must invite Michael Bublé on the podcast, and we want to know what's on his Sexy Time playlist.
I did an interview, and they're like, have you heard about this Jonas Brothers thing? And they were like, what did you think of it? And I was like, well, it's reciprocal.
We talk about Kevin's confession, Michael's reaction, and a whole lot more. Our conversation with Michael Bublé is out now. Listen to Hey Jonas on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
30 years ago, an island off Manhattan almost brought down New York City.
Who will you trust? Your friends and neighbors? Or will you trust the people 5 miles overseas?
This is a story about neighbors turning on each other and what happens when a forgotten place decides it's had enough.
But we're not stopping, are we?
Listen to Revisionist History, The Staten Island Problem on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.